In order to add the Azure Developer CLI to deploy this to the Azure cloud, I'm going to add the developer container feature for Azure Developer CLI. This requires a rebuild of the dev container. At the end of the dev container, I spit out the node npm and get versions to indicate that I'm at the end of the dev container startup. Next, I'm going to check the version of the AZD I installed. That's another way to make sure that it works correctly, and the version is 1.5. I need to authenticate to Microsoft with Microsoft Logon in a separate window, and I also need to have an Azure subscription to deploy to the Azure cloud. Just remember what this project is configured for. If I look in the API to do folder, I see it does have a tsconfig.json file, so it is a TypeScript project. I'm hoping AZD recognizes that project and builds the correct infrastructure from that repository. It selected JavaScript. It did recognize the API to do folder. And it's selected Azure Container Apps as the deployment environment, which is what I want. The port is 3000, and the name I'm going to give this project is CloudNative004-01, which will show up in the resource group name when I look in the Azure portal. It created the Azure YAML file I need for deployment, a markdown file of next steps, and then the infra folder, which is where all the bicep provisioning is. You can see in the Azure YAML, it's found my API to do folder, next steps. The next step it wants me to work on is environment variables. And then in the infrastructure folder, the main bicep is the top level bicep. It's creating my resource group, some other resources, and at the bottom it has my API to do project deploying to an Azure Container App. I'm going to go ahead and add that Container Apps endpoint URI as an output variable so that I can use that in my playwright tests. So I'm going to test the deployment, and it needs the Docker tools to deploy, which is the error it's trying to tell me. So I'm going to add that also as a dev container feature. Dev container features are managed by whoever wrote those features, so I don't have to deal with it. It does require a rebuild. The rebuild fails. Since I'm working on a Mac M1, that would be my conclusion, is that it has something to do with my Mac M1. Looking at the logs, I can see it's working on Python. Then there's an error about external dependencies, and then the last one is Docker and Docker. When I scroll to the right, you'll see there's the feature itself's repository has a troubleshooting guide. If you go look in there, there is an issue about the Mac M1s. That's sort of a rabbit hole I don't want to get stuck in. I'm just going to back up to the previous version of Docker and hope it fixes it. So I see my versions being spit out, so that's an indication that the dev container started correctly. Now I want to see what version of Docker it did install.